So I'm going to get that going if I'm able to do that. Okay, I think it's happening. Okay, great. So again, just for the sake of everyone watching this, whenever you are, I am Rajani with Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition. We are going to have for the next hour and a half this lovely conversation, part of our event series called More Than a Needle, More Than a Crackpipe, Racism and Safer Drug Use Supplies. This is part 2. Part 1, you should definitely catch on YouTube. That was with Loris Maddox from Oakland, where we talked about public health approaches to the criminalization of drugs and paraphernalia. And this time we were talking, why is this a police reform issue? Why is paraphernalia decriminalization a police reform issue? And so I'm going to set the stage a bit so folks can know kind of what's going on with the paraphernalia decrim bill. And I will introduce our panelists. I'm going to ask them some questions. They're going to give us glorious answers, and then we're going to close out. And what we're going to do is, as we close out, we're going to talk about we're going to give you all some offerings on what you can do with all this information. And believe me, we have plenty of opportunities for you to engage with this content. Today, we're not going to have any Q&A. We're just fully download of this conversation, but I will say on the screen, you'll see tomorrow that you can join on Facebook Live on the BHRC Facebook. There'll be a conversation with Cam and Harriet around messaging and doing crafts and having conversation and figuring out action step stuff. So that's at 5:30 tomorrow. And again, this is a recorded event to be shared with those who've registered via Eventbrite. And one of the goals here is to explore the lessons from tonight. Join BHRC tomorrow, right? So setting the stage, I'd like to say first, we have Yanet Amanuel, who is a public policy advocate at the ACLU of Maryland. She supports coalitions, monitors pertinent legislation that impacts civil liberties. I think has been with part of the Bridges Coalition for Overdose Prevention Sites. So I think that's I believe is how we got connected in that work. But I really admire the work around police accountability, prisoners' rights, like that kind of work is so powerful, voting rights. Yanet began her advocacy career as a student organizer in College Park, and she received her BA in sociology. And she continued to pursue her passion for advocacy and organizing in several roles, including as chief of staff for Prince George's County Legislator, Region 7 Adult Representative on the NAACP National Youth Works Committee, Young Adult Chair of the Prince George's County NAACP, and as a policy advocate at JOTF. Most recently, Yanet co-led the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability and Legislative Advocacy to repeal what we've coined as LEOBOR, which is a Law Enforcement Officer's Bill of Rights, and reform the Maryland Public Information Act, which is known as Anton's Law, to allow public discourse of police misconduct recordings during the 2021 legislative session. Y'all, those hearings were out of control and so amazing. And so they're all recorded, and I highly suggest people check them out. Rob Ferrell also is joining me. Rob is an organizer committed to the liberation of all Black people. With family roots in the U.S. Virgin Islands, he is passionate about ending the colonial project in all of its manifestations. Rob came into movement through the frame of direct action and believes in the transformational power of direct action and political education. Rob is a lifelong learner and teacher and works as a lead trainer in the Ella Baker Organizing Institute to build the capacity of the next generation of Black organizers. He rarely leaves home without his camera. I have experienced this and also have had many lovely pictures taken. So, I'm happy about it. Rob is dedicated to archiving Black-led movement spaces with documentary photography. Please check that out. And fine art portraiture. He's on IG. Rob enjoys cooking, refereeing soccer games. I did not actually know that. Taking care of his 50+ houseplants, playing with his cat Oshun, and shelling down any fete or carnival. And he is a founding member of Organizing Black. And so you should definitely check all of that out. Oh my God, is that Oshun? Oh my God. Yes, I should get my bunny. We'll just always bring our family. Okay, so we are going to get into conversation with these lovely, lovely folks. But before that, setting the stage around the issues that we at BHRC have been pushing around, and the conversation will very much focus on the history of policing, the role that police have had in further, finding these insidious ways to continue to criminalize us, and the ways that we can jump ahead. And so what I'm asking all of us who are here, who are really folks in our harm reduction community, to keep in mind is that, around how is this all connected back to the decriminalization of paraphernalia. So as a reminder, 2016, there was a legislation to expand syringe service programs that we refer to as SSP. It was granted an exemption for possession of some paraphernalia for authorized participants. Basically, programs like BHRC that are authorized syringe service programs, there's an exception for our participants to carry the supplies we are giving them, the healthcare supplies we are giving them. The way that looks is people have to carry around a little card, and if stopped by the police, the idea is that they can show them this card and the police will say, oh, okay, you are authorized to carry those supplies. Part of what we're talking about today is how we can't trust the police to actually do that, right? But that is a law, one of the steps to keep it moving. Okay, 2018, what a lot of us know as is fentanyl testing strips, but strips that are used to test for any kind of drug in any substance, paraphernalia law criminalizing items to test or analyze drugs was repealed. So people were allowed to carry these tester supplies. 2019 was the first introduction of, we say our paraphernalia decrim bill on possession for personal use. Our is a bill that BHRC had helped to kind of herald and move forward. This is a picture from 2019 with Delegate David Moon, who continues to be our champion on the bill. It was first brought in 2020, didn't really move anywhere. First brought in 2019. 2020, it actually moved pretty far. The bill was reintroduced and had a strong showing, but as many of us might remember, if we can remember 2020, the COVID pandemic hitting Maryland caused us to cut short the session, and this bill couldn't move out of committee. So it was brought back. We brought it back in spring 2021. It was Senate Bill 420. There was also a House bill. The Senate Bill 420 was voted out of both chambers, as in it passed across all Maryland legislators. They said, yes, let's decriminalize paraphernalia. A month later, vetoed by Governor Hogan, which we will get into. And that is where we are at, right? So winter 2021, the action we are all moving towards is for Senate President Ferguson to call for a vote on a veto override for Senate Bill 420 so that we can actually decriminalize paraphernalia. If that veto override vote does not happen, then we bring it back next year. So that's the situation, y'all. That's the bill. And bringing this higher, right? Bringing these issues to a higher context of philosophy. As supporters of BHRC, who I expect you all to memorize our mission statement, a piece of our mission statement, which we take very seriously, is that harm reduction is part of a broader movement for social justice. So what that means for us tonight is that decriminalization of drug paraphernalia is a piece of the police reform puzzle. I want us to interrogate that and think about that and keep that moving. As harm reductionists, we must support an end to the drug war, which requires us to interrogate any dedication to policing institutions. And our culture is designed to police and uphold racism and classism. So what that means is that it's institutionalized through policing, medical institutions, child welfare, housing. So these are the assumptions that we're walking into with this conversation. And I'll go to the first question, but I'm curious, Rob, did you want to share something?
Just quickly troubleshooting, because I have folks that are saying that they're stuck in a waiting room. That is probably
because my speaker. So hello, say that one more time.
Oh, I was just quickly troubleshooting because folks are saying that they're stuck in the waiting room, but I don't want to interrupt.
No worries. Thanks. Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Rob. Okay, cool. So these are the assumptions we are using, again, at BHRC. When we say assumptions, we're talking about like our grounding, our philosophy we are walking into with this conversation. So everybody breathe. This was really mostly a note for Rajani because I got to breathe. Lots of words, lots of things. This is going to be heavy, as it always is. You came here knowing that. And also, we will be talking about the history of policing and the history of racism. And for many of us in highly melanated, beautiful bodies, that is, we have a lot of feelings that can show up in a lot of ways. So please take care of yourself. Get water, get whatever drugs you want. We're not judging. We are here. And take care of yourself. Again, this is recorded, so you can always stop and come back to it another time. Thank you so much for that moment. We are starting here. So let me get myself together. So in efforts to advance the connections between harm reduction and social justice, we must explore history. Our nation's 146-year-old drug war has led to drug exceptionalism, in which possession of substances that have been used as medicine, cannabis, heroin, fentanyl, have all been used as medicine. Those and tools to consume these drugs have been criminalized. So the first question to Yanet and Rob is, how has the enforcement of these laws criminalized Black and Brown communities?
That is a fantastic question and something we can definitely spend a lot of time talking about. But you're absolutely right that harm reduction and police reform are undoubtedly interconnected, and mass incarceration and just the criminalization of Black people for drug use or even sale of drug use or possession of paraphernalia, you name it, is a direct result of racist policing that enforces racist policies. And it's been going on forever. And in order to acknowledge or even find a solution, we have to acknowledge the history and what it's rooted in. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the history of policing and tie it into the war on drugs. So in the informal policing was really first seen in the North, in Boston in the mid 1600s with the Boston Watch, which was essentially a neighborhood watch in which volunteers signed up mostly to look out for people engaging in prostitution or gambling. In the South, slave patrols were created with one mission in mind, and that was to establish a system of terror and squash slave uprisings and return runaway slaves to their owners. And then and that can be traced as early as the 1600s as well. And their duties were actually written into law in some places, like in Louisiana with the Slave Patrol Statute of 1835. After the Civil War ended, slave patrols developed into Southern police departments. And part of their early duties post-Civil War was to monitor the behavior of newly freed slaves and enforce segregation policies per the era's Black codes and Jim Crow laws. And so I think that's really important place to highlight, because we didn't see kind of like the end, quote unquote, of Jim Crow laws until the late 60s. And then we see like the war on drugs officially really being launched in 1970. So Black people have never gotten a break. And the war on drugs was officially started by Richard Nixon in 1970, which resulted in marijuana being added to a Schedule I drug, which is usually reserved for what they quote unquote is the most dangerous drugs that have no medical benefit, which is ironic because marijuana used to be used for medicine back in the day, in the early 1800s. And so in 1970, we started to see tougher drug sentencing laws, billions of money going into police enforcement and militarization, and led to what we have now is our huge mass incarceration problem, which we all know was a deliberate strategy to weaken the anti-war and Black liberation movements at that time, and something Nixon's former counsel admitted to decades later. And it is important to note that a lot of the the collateral consequences of incarceration that we see today are extensions or help uphold a lot of the Black codes and Jim Crow laws enforced by slave patrols earlier on, like not being able to vote, losing your Second Amendment rights, being limited to movement due to your parole or probation, the list goes on. But it's important to also note that if you look back even further to the early 20th century, you see that there were drug laws created to target and control and punish people of color then too. What's interesting is that the production of hemp was actually encouraged by the US government for the production of rope, sails, and clothing in the early 1600s. And marijuana was also just a popular ingredient in many medicinal products that were sold openly in public pharmacies in the late 19th century. But after the Mexican Revolution of 1910 and just the more influx of immigrants moving to the United States and recreational use of marijuana being associated with immigrants and Mexicans, then we start to see marijuana become outlawed in several states and then later federally. And so the enforcement of these laws has destroyed generations of families and led to unnecessary and harmful interactions with police and the criminal legal system. And is obviously, continues to be something that we see today. And so I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. And I'm so impressed with your ability to bring that deep history so concisely, right? And the ways that paraphernalia is so deeply associated with the drugs themselves, that opium den, starting with, what are these signs that in implementation, when police are trying to catch people, they will look for these signs of what could I possibly charge you with? And that being something that was developed kind of after the fact almost, right, as time was going on. So thank you so much for sharing that. Rob, wanted to, as we've been talking, you've kind of helped to always make this connection to capitalism, incarceration. So I'm wondering if you can bring that in this.
Yeah. For me, the police exists purely as a form of social control to maintain the white supremacist colonial state that is America, right? So this nation state was built on slavery and enslavement through capitalism, with the free labor force being Black people, right? And so after emancipation, they needed a way to maintain that free labor source, right? So police are being used to round up Black people to put them in jail for arbitrary reasons, and they'll make up any, the Black codes and Jim Crow, or just inserting any kind of reason to incarcerate people. And in my opinion, drug use is just another one of those excuses or arbitrary reasons to do so. And the incentive is to maintain that free labor force for capitalism in America. And so I'll always go back to that. Obviously, anti-Blackness is woven intricately through that, but there's a monetary benefit for the elite and the capitalist class. So just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you. Whew. Okay, so that's the grounding, really, right? That is the culture, the structure, the history, the legacy of this history, right? At Baltimore Racial Justice Action, I've learned this phrase of the legacy of enslavement, or the legacy of anti-Blackness that comes into play, that is in this, is the grounding of these concepts that we've just normalized, right? These ideas that, oh yes, if somebody has needles on them, that means XYZ. And that comes from somewhere. And so this history is really, truly where that comes from. I'm gonna take us to the next question that brings this, continues this. So let's get more of my things together. Okay, so in vetoing Senate Bill 420 to decriminalize paraphernalia, Governor Hogan claimed the bill would permit drug dealers to stockpile large quantities of paraphernalia, such as needles and syringes, and sell it to vulnerable individuals suffering from addiction. So that is his reasoning for vetoing this bill, and a reason that sort of was circled around and brought up in confusion to create confusion and chaos on sign or die, the last day of session, when legislators were making this decision. Legislators moved through that argument that conservatives still passed the bill, but then Governor Hogan brought it back again and said this specific thing. They will stockpile large quantities of paraphernalia. I just want to remind everybody that there's so many things I want to remind people of, but the one thing that keeps coming to my mind is the fact that there are 20 plus syringe service programs authorized by the state of Maryland to give these supplies for free. So that is just not economically feasible for anybody to be trying to sell stuff that you can get for free, for one, let alone the fact that this is racist as hell. Right? We know what coded language, because of the increasingly white face of opioid use, the white face of addiction that keeps being created in our media, what he's talking about of the vulnerable individuals suffering from addiction. We never would have heard that 20, 30 years ago, right? So that language, and then who are these people, these drug dealers? We know there are images conjured of young Black men. So I hope I didn't necessarily need to say that to a lot of people, but I am saying it for clarity. So this was his reasoning to veto the bill. And the question is, how can we critically analyze the vilification of dealers and drug sellers by our current administration? And where does this fit in with the patterns to remove power from Black communities? Yanet, I'll start with you.
Another great question. Well, first I'll start by just saying that passing SB 420 and overriding the governor's veto is a matter of good public policy. It's a matter of addressing some of the wrongs with our drug policy laws, and also a public health, just good for public health in general. And so we should absolutely, that absolutely does need to happen this year. And I think this is part of a larger issue that we've been seeing, and that's one, decriminalization is honestly not enough. And we saw this with just what's been happening with marijuana decriminalization to begin with. We decriminalized marijuana in 2014 for possession of 10 grams. And what we've seen is that there has still been an uptick of Black people being charged with possession with intent to distribute, when they should more appropriately probably be charged with possession. But because that's now a civil fine, they'd rather charge them with PWID, even though they don't have most of the time enough evidence or even a scale. So they're just completely eyeballing it. And so that's been a trend here in Maryland, but also nationwide. And in some places, actually have seen worse racial disparities with marijuana possession than before decriminalization in states that have not legalized because of just this inconsistency and enforcement issues. And so to your point, I want to come back to your point real quick about the vilification of drug dealers. And what's kind of frustrating about this is that those of us who have studied this issue or are just from the communities that we're advocating on behalf of understand that a lot of those quote unquote drug dealers are just individuals who are trying to get by, who are trying to make ends meet, provide for their family, and are not like these monsters the way that folks would want to paint them. And it's because it makes what they're doing easier to justify. And instead of addressing that, it's actually a lot more gray, and actually these are actually real people, and the real issue is these underlying issues as to why people resort to selling drugs to begin with. And instead of discussing that and addressing those issues, would rather villainize folks, particularly Black people, for just trying to get by. And to come back to the whole issue of decriminalization, some of the stats that we've seen in Maryland, which are pretty alarming. I'll highlight Baltimore County, for example. Between 2018 and 2019 in Baltimore County, there were 1,314 people charged with possession of marijuana over 10 grams, allegedly. Again, no scales used, they're eyeballed. And despite Black people only making up 30% of Baltimore County's population, they made up 80% of those who were arrested for possession. And of those 1,314 cases or arrests, only 33 actually ended in convictions, which doesn't mean that these folks weren't actually incarcerated or spent some time due to that arrest, but these only 33 leading to conviction tells us that they're using the majority of these interactions just to detain and improperly search folks. And so it's just another an example, a current example, a recent example of them just continuing to use this as a tool to criminalize and over police Black people. And another interesting statistic that came out of the recent ACLU, National ACLU report on marijuana across the marijuana decriminalization and legalization efforts across the country is that in Maryland, the racial disparities in marijuana possession arrests are alarmingly higher in Cecil, Carroll, Queens Anne, Frederick, and Allegheny counties than the national average, and it's actually almost double the national average. And so this is consistently and still a huge problem, and decriminalization is just simply not enough. And it just shows that despite the same rates of use, despite some of the changes that we've made, it's still not enough. And connecting this back to the police reform, this last summer, we lost one of the family members we've been working with, and that's the family, well, his name was DeMonte Ward Blake. And so we were working closely with his family after an incident that happened in 2019, where he was pulled over for a brake light in Prince George's County that later turned into the police officers saying he smelled marijuana, searching him, arresting him, and then still brutalizing him after he was in handcuffs, and ended up with him falling and breaking his neck on the sidewalk and being paralyzed from the waist down, and then later dying from his injuries. And so this is just to highlight some of the real collateral consequences of these unnecessary interactions with law enforcement off of something that a white person would not be suffering similar consequences with, or similar interactions with police officers for, and how urgent it is that we address these issues immediately.
Damn, Yanet.
I know. I was like, woo! Just spinning and spinning. Okay, Rob.
I'm gonna try and get in where I fit in there. I think she like really adequately covered most of the things, but there's a couple things that stand out to me around this depiction of drug dealers being violent.
Yeah.
This idea that these people are inherently criminal and violent, and they'll find any way to exploit this like gaping loophole that he's trying to prevent. The insidious part about it for me is that it shows that he understands that these people don't have much, and that they're trying to survive. Right? He's trying to use the language of capitalism to say that these people will find this, you take this market and like and try and sell it, and like, okay, so what about the underlying conditions that created that? Is that not violent? Like,
right.
To me, it's
right. What is violent?
It screams anti-Blackness and an intentional effort to continue the oppression of Black people. And going to piggyback off Yanet's understanding of how these drugs are used as excuses to lock Black people up. The vast majority of people, and I'll just re-emphasize, the vast majority of people that are behind bars pre-trial, right? They have not been convicted of anything, and half the time they're released, or they're only in jail because they can't afford bail, right? And so the idea is to remove the legal frameworks that allow for these interactions to happen in the first place. The last thing that I'll say is that the way that the war on drugs interacts with the war on guns, right? So even if they had a legal amount of marijuana during the traffic stop, they might have had an illegal firearm, or an unregistered firearm, excuse me. I used the correct terminology. And so that excuse of "I smelled cannabis on you" is an excuse to now arrest you for drug charges, right? And there's this way that the war on drugs and the war on guns is intricately tied together, and they work hand in hand. And so, for some folks may know that if you are a legal user of cannabis, like a permitted user that you are not allowed to own a firearm, right? And if you have a felony charge, you are now a prohibited person and not allowed to legally own a firearm in general, right? And we can go down the rabbit hole of how like the laws in Maryland are set up so that people cannot use firearms to protect themselves through the law, right? We can't. It's like virtually impossible to get a permit to carry a gun legally. But in Baltimore and in other places, people feel compelled to carry to protect themselves, right? So these drugs create the opportunity to ensnare people into the system unnecessarily. And I'll just say that. I'll just end there.
The other thing I'd like to lift up is the impact that these laws have on immigration as well, which I think a lot of folks don't really think much about, and some don't even know about. I got my citizenship in 2018 and did not know the effect that having a possession charge could potentially end up with you being deported. And so that's a real issue as well. And we know that most people don't associate immigration issues with Black people, but it's absolutely a Black issue as well. And so that is also Black and brown. So that's definitely connected to this larger issue as well, because if they're targeting Black people, they might pick up a Black immigrant who then their consequences have been greater than just incarceration. They might be getting sent back to the last place they want to be. And so I want to lift that up, and just how important some of the reforms we're going to talk about later are critical, not only just for everyone that the populations we're talking about, but also for those who are immigrants as well.
Ooh, yes, it's all connected to so many systems. And I just want to say, this is not something that's on my mind as we're talking. And it is in my mind, as someone who is actively a supporter of ending the drug war and seeing this, like, it's not a question to me, Rajani, as to how decriminalizing needles and pipes that can be used to smoke drugs, including crack, including meth, including whatever, decriminalizing those pieces is a step towards more work, right? And I say all that to say, we've had a lot of conversations, I think, around the role of racial justice in cannabis decriminalization, right? And I think it's a wealth of knowledge and experience we can draw from as folks who are working on opioid and other drugs, just working on other drugs, right? Around decriminalization of other drugs. And it's a space we can draw from. It's like, okay, what have they done? What lessons have we learned? I've learned so many lessons from y'all about in moving cannabis decriminalization with reparations. How do we kind of mimic that or draw from that in the other work? I feel like I'm rambling, but there's like something there that I feel like we really just need to say out loud, right? Because I have this irky feeling, just to be honest, and I know, and I love all the folks in my harm reduction community, but often we'll be like, well, they're talking about cannabis. What does that have to do with these drugs? Because the paraphernalia used for cannabis to smoke weed, we say cannabis just because I say cannabis, marijuana, weed, whatever, those, if you have the medical card, you can carry what you need to consume that drug, right? So the bill, SB 420, is not about paraphernalia. I mean, that's what legislators say. It is not about paraphernalia to consume cannabis. Also, you can use anything to consume cannabis or whatever. It's just, the point is, there's been an effort to separate this bill from cannabis policy. And I want to find a way to connect that right now, because I think we have a couple of minutes to do that. I'm just curious what y'all are thinking around this drug exceptionalism issue, or like, how do you see the cannabis policy work connecting to these other drugs,
It's all the same for me.
It's all the same,
like,
right? Okay.
Like people, excuse me, people should have the right to use whatever it is that they want to use for whatever reason that they want to use it. Right. I think there's a perception that people that use opioids are victims, right, or
vulnerable individuals who are
vulnerable, or there's something wrong with them. Maybe they just like to get high. The fuck? Like, right. I don't think there's anything wrong with that per se. Like, I think that there should be ways that people can use these substances safely, right? Without the threat of being criminalized and then thrown in jail, right? Or worse in the course of the interaction with law enforcement. So yeah.
Right.
There's also
Yeah.
this issue where certain policymakers have already spent the legalization revenue before it's even been legalized yet. And they have all these ideas to use it for everything except for what it actually should be used for. And that's to reinvest in the communities that have been directly impacted by the war on drugs. Instead, they'll try to then, if you just plainly say war on drugs, and they'll just say, well, okay, we should use that money for opioid
Yeah.
services and stuff like that. And we're like, no, you're moving away from what we're talking about. And especially trying to offer redress for the harms that have been done through mass incarceration, that's going to take a lot of work. We're talking about generations of damage here that's going to require that funding. Instead, they're trying to already allocate it to all these other places, but actually addressing the harms that have been done. And we have to, and it shouldn't be separated between, this is a more easier drug to sell than it is than compared to maybe some other drugs. I think all of that is subjective and is based off just propaganda. And at the end of the day, it's about individual autonomy. Like Rob said, people should be able to make the decisions of their own lives without, and even if you disagree or whatever, we all can agree. And there's studies that show that criminalizing it absolutely doesn't work. So we know that for a fact, and that should be immediately something that we, when you know better, you do better. And it's like, we know, but like, we're still not doing better. So when are we going to catch up? I think is really the question.
Oh, yes. Go
And
ahead.
like when we say it doesn't work, we know that those people aren't getting help if they're being put in prison. We know that those people are being exploited for their labor when they're being put in prison. Like let's not act like we're acting in the best interest of those folks, because that's not what this is.
It's not what it is. And I'm so glad, Yanet, you brought up that so often we see so many times, especially with so much Hogan calling himself a champion, and also something else he named in his letter, that he is a champion around ending the overdose crisis and ending the opioid epidemic, and all the words he said. He's a champion for it. He did all these things. Okay. Aside from the fact that he didn't do all those things, and we have in harm reduction work have fought tooth and nail, there is this consistent thing that a champion for racism is exactly true. Gold medal is this, well, what we need to do, and I see this with paraphernalia decriminalization, is, well, how are we going to ensure if we just decriminalize, right, then we can't ensure that the folks accessing these supplies are having contact with someone who will give them referral to force them into treatment, to then force them to stop using, right? Essentially. And it's something I hear too with cannabis work. It's like, oh, if we're going to move this work, this false concept that it would be a reparations idea to allocate money towards drug court, which is relying on the system. I hear this consistently. Well, what we need to do is put more energy into drug court. That is not what
reinforcing the legal industry now, because that was something that was said today during the marijuana work group session, is that, well, now that we're going to legalize and we're planning to get all this money from it, well, what happens if people still resort to the black market, especially if we tax too high? What do we do then? And the response was, well, the enforcement mechanisms are really important. So what what you're saying is, we're going to legalize it, we're still going to criminalize people because we want to make sure that we get their money and it's not going to them, not now because we think it's a dangerous substance, but because the money is, it should be coming to us and not to them, which is absolutely ridiculous. And the piece about the money is really important. And we have to also learn from the mistakes that other states have made. And what we've seen is this trend in other states is that they might they'll legalize marijuana, they'll increase the legal threshold, and they'll have some expungement. There's I think issues with that too, because when you just allow for expungement, that onus is still on the people to, that burden to file and go through that whole process is on them. When if we're acknowledging that this should have never happened and this was wrong, then we should be vacating these convictions and they should be completely destroyed. They shouldn't be lingering and still existing in some office somewhere that it could still somehow still be used in the future. Just completely destroy it. And then second, that money, needs to go directly to those communities that have been impacted by the war on drugs. And there's a metric that we can come up to, identify those counties and localities here in Maryland. And those individuals from those communities should have direct say in how that money is spent in their community. It's going to look different in different places. And the majority of this money needs to go to these communities. But what we've seen in other states is they'll create like a social equity fund or some kind of state board that is filled with industry folks or alike, and then they either have people apply or they'll decide how that money is spent, but that money rarely ever actually goes to those communities. And so that is something we've identified as an issue in other areas, and we need to make sure doesn't happen here in Maryland. And then also people again feeding into that whole like fear mongering and just creating hysteria over issues are not really a thing. And so with other states, what we've seen is at least 20% of the revenue go to the increasing the police department's budget, because they're saying they're going to need all this equipment and resources to be able to find people who are driving while impaired. While there are no studies to show that post-legalization, there's all of a sudden an influx in folks driving while impaired, but whoever was doing it before is going to do it when it's legalized. And there's nothing to indicate that that's even a trend. But that is something that they'll try to use to just take this money that they, for some reason, feel like they're entitled to when now we're saying we're legalizing because we're acknowledging that so much has happened in the past and we were wrong, but you clearly haven't learned from it and you're trying to capitalize from that harm and not actually do anything to address or reinvest in those communities that you've harmed.
The one thing that I'll point out about the purpose of not vacating those convictions is to maintain the oppression at the ballot box of folks that have been that have felony records, right? And in many states, felons can't vote, right? And in states like Florida and others, the folks that were incarcerated, even if they have, or in Florida specifically, they implemented fines that they have to pay back to then be able to vote, right? So it's all in broad daylight a way to oppress Black people in any way, shape, or form, while now finding legal ways to make money.
Right.
And we should be looking at the citations and seeing who's actually getting these citations, because I think if we really look at that, we'll see exactly who it is and need to also, what are the consequences for those individuals who can't afford those citations. And
Right.
that could be another process that we're not even identified yet as entrapping more people into that cycle of criminalization of poverty, while white people are benefiting from decriminalization.
And I'm really glad you brought that up too, because I will say, one of the biggest debates also with Senate Bill 420 is really having to be clear with policymakers. Oh, don't worry, right back to this vilification of dealing, this vilification of manufacturing. This is also manufacturing of paraphernalia, right? So we keep going, they're like, oh, manufacturing drugs. Like, no, this is about paraphernalia only. You're just talking about making needles that people already, okay. So there's this concern. So we've had to kind of narrow the scope of this bill to be very specific for personal use. And so there are pieces around that debated around, well, if, that amount, what is that amount threshold when it's now PWID or possession with intent to distribute? And then that can be citationable amounts, and then, incarceration associated with it, that sort of thing. And so I bring that up because the citations is really often considered this way of, I brought it up because we needed to create that clarity in the bill to say, no, this is just about personal use in order to move it forward. We don't want to throw sellers under the bus. And there's still this citation is still, especially when it has this associated charge. Well, it depends on how you consider debt, right? I consider debt just another form of incarceration. So what are we really doing when we're saying, oh, don't worry about it, it's just a civil case, or it's just a citationable situation? Yeah, that's just coming to my mind right now as we think about what needs to come next moving forward from this bill.
Especially when they're like, well, how are you going to pay for this? Well, what are y'all doing with the citation money? Because there's all this money you've been collecting.
Right.
Where are y'all using it for?
Tell me about them coins though, right? Just tell me what's happening with this money. Well, so, okay, let's, we've been talking about the drug war this whole time. And I want to bring up my best friend, Senate President Bill Ferguson. I've been saying his name a lot, manifesting him into my life. So in the last hours of the 2021 legislative session, after passing Senate Bill 420, Senate President Bill Ferguson identified himself as a proponent of the bill. He voted yes on it, and he said the war on drugs has failed. It has failed. It has fundamentally failed. We have destroyed segments of our society. If we do not have a new approach to drugs, we will continue down the same path. And honestly, it was a beautiful moment. It was like 11:15 p.m. And he didn't need to say anything. And he said this, and I was taken aback. And he is now our main legislative target to say, hey, we remember that time you said that. It'd be really cool if you brought this vote, because that's that was well said. So now we're seeking his action to call for a vote to override Hogan's veto. And so I'm bringing this up because he said it himself, right? So the question is, there's many questions. One question I would love to pose, and we can go from there, is if decriminalizing paraphernalia is a step, as he said, along this path to ending the drug war, how do we move from these incremental reforms to full-on abolition? You know, what does that mean? Because I think that's an important piece of this puzzle. So, Rob, I'm wondering if I can go to you.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute.
That's okay. Yeah, I was wondering if you can speak to that a bit.
For me, it requires getting cops out of my damn community. If cops aren't in my community, then we're not having these arrests, or like none of this is even a conversation, right? So that's where the work that I'm working on, defunding police, comes in. It's like when you take cops out of those neighborhoods, you decrease the likelihood of having the interaction to begin with. So that's a big thing for me, is like just reducing the likelihood of the interaction of police and Black people. Moves us closer to abolition. And the idea is that this whole conversation is linked to abolition, because the idea is to reduce the role and the scope of police work in our society gradually to the point where they're irrelevant. And the only way that we do that is to also not just decrease, but invest resources and create systems of care for the folks that are using these drugs, right? So what does that look like? How can we invest in the work of Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition and other folks that are creating safe spaces for people to use, while also doing the political education necessary to make these kind of conversations commonplace, to the point where we change the narrative and the overall thought process around people that use drugs. And what will happen, hopefully, is to the point where in our individual lives, right, we love to think of this in this like massive scale. How are we doing this work in our communities, like our families, our friends, the folks that are in our circle, the folks that you know on this call, the folks that you know that are using opioids, right? How are we creating systems of care for those folks? So it's doing both at the same time, like reducing the likelihood of interaction of Black people and others with police, while creating systems of care that care for the folks' needs.
I think I have a three-part answer. My first thing that I'll say is I think public education and organizing in our communities and in our own families to really, I think, hold ourselves accountable and ask the question, what does it really mean to love Black people, to love your community? And, you know, just because something isn't your thing, you know, doesn't mean that individuals should be criminalized and their whole lives be destructed by it. People are entitled to their own decisions. And what does it mean to love people despite that? And really, and I think that will force us to challenge ourselves to kind of deconstruct and kind of just change the way we've been trained to think about certain things. I think even within the Black community, you associate, oh, marijuana, okay, depending on the generation, you're like, okay, that's cool. But then you talk about some of these other drugs, it's like, oh no, that's crazy, whatever. But it's like, but Black people are still impacted by this issue. So even despite whatever I might feel about it, or what I'm, just because it's not my thing, that person is still being impacted by this issue of being criminalized. So that is now my issue because it is affecting my neighbor, my community. So I think that is important work to be done, because I think that helps kind of trickle down to just being helpful with the organizing, political education piece, if they're hearing from their constituents and this is what they're hearing, instead of the fear and propaganda that has been instilled in them since birth. So in doing that work, I think is a form of love and just loving your neighbor and just what it means to really truly love Black people. The other piece about it, I think two tangible things that are kind of things that we're working on right now is, so we know we passed police reform last session, didn't go nearly as far as it should have. And one of the most important components that we were fighting for was civilian oversight boards with authority to really hold police officers accountable and is centered in community. So it's the community folks on the board with no political affiliations, no affiliations to police, that are making decisions on police misconduct, and it being actually able to, that decision actually being binding instead of just a recommendation that actually doesn't hold any weight, which is how a lot of civilian oversight boards have been structured. Intentionally to weaken that power that the community can have. And so we've made some slight progress, but we're currently organizing right now in every jurisdiction to get folks on these police accountability boards that are mandated, make sure there are people that are actually going to truly be accountable to the community, make sure they're budgeted and staffed correctly. Some jurisdictions like Baltimore City and Prince George's County already have investigative powers, so make sure they have the funding to actually have proper investigators and not just one who can't work all the time. And there's billions, hundreds of misconduct cases to look through. So make sure that those are properly staffed, and then eventually organizing and working towards getting those binding powers is something that we're trying to work towards. So those are ongoing efforts that folks can plug into. We're trying to give the police accountability powers to the CRB this session, the Baltimore Civilian Review Board. So that's a bill that they're going to be working on this session that folks can support, making sure that they're properly funded. They have the powers to appoint folks to the charging committees that are established in this new bill instead of creating a new entity when the CRB already exists. And that's similar efforts are going in different parts of across the state. And then lastly, this session, the ACLU of Maryland and our partners at the Leaders of Beautiful Struggle and other folks are working on a bill with Senator Carter to legalize marijuana, and will include some of those important elements that I mentioned earlier, the vacature of marijuana-related charges, resentencing opportunities for individuals who are currently incarcerated, codifying the no-smell search from the Court of Appeals ruling and expanding that to vehicle searches as well, prohibiting testing of marijuana for folks on parole and probation. Ultimately left to work to all drugs, but parole for those on parole and probation. And then most importantly, the piece that I was talking about the at least 60% of the revenue from marijuana going directly to those communities that have been identified as being impacted by the war on drugs, and going directly to their council so that they can be a part of a collaborative effort to figure out how that money is spent. And then also just business opportunities that don't, so like micro business licenses for individuals that to be able to benefit from marijuana legalization and being able to just financially benefit from the legalization, and not requiring them and by having it be micro licenses requires less capital than it would if they were going to open up a dispensary or something like that. So it's easier for just everyday folks to be able to access that industry. And so those are things that are all going to be included in this bill. Finally, it was pre-filed, so in a couple of weeks have more information about how folks can plug in. But that is something that we're working on this session and need absolutely all the support for, because if you've been paying attention to any of the work group hearings, it's sounding like we haven't caught up to the times yet. So it's going to definitely take a lot of us to make sure we get something good out.
Yes, thank you so much. You answered a lot of the questions I was going to kind of come to. And one thing I do want to say about these, I honestly don't even remember what CPIC stands for. Rob and I were on this CPIC meeting last night. Let me just go ahead and say, and I was like, okay, it's gonna be my first one. What does CPIC stand for, first of all? Community,
You asking the wrong dude, but I'll look it up, you know.
Okay, it's about community policing and something. Okay, so it's the first meeting I went to, and I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna sit here, I'm gonna listen. And the 2 minutes, 30 seconds into me joining this meeting, they're like, okay, we're going to provide information. This police officer is going to provide information about all the work they do around naloxone and using naloxone, police officers and the training they get on naloxone, which for folks who might not know is a medication to reverse opioid overdoses. And so I will not humbly say that Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition, my coworkers who are on this call, Harriet, Dave, Ricky, Owen, folks who are doing naloxone distribution, reversing overdoses constantly. I mean, just amazing. Community-based heroes. People who use drugs are the ones to reverse more overdoses than anybody else. And if you ever hear police officers say that they do it most, they are lying. That is truly a lie. And so it is extremely frustrating knowing the frustrations. I'm not going to go into too much. The police come to us asking us to give them naloxone regularly through our mail order naloxone program. I mean, it is fucked. And so I say all that to say, when a police officer is talking about celebrating their naloxone distribution and the ways that I've experienced having trained officers in how to give naloxone and how to administer it to people, and the vitriolic stigma that comes up in these trainings when they're like, oh, I have to touch somebody, like, whoo, y'all, it hurts my body. And so in that call, I said, what you can do, everybody, is come to Fridays, everybody here, come to Fridays, BHRC free public naloxone training where you can learn how to carry it. Because I'm hoping anybody who isn't an officer will likely be much more compassionate in those moments for folks. And so I needed to say that now, because it is something that comes up regularly. And it is a way that police identify themselves as heroes in community, and why they're needed is around the overdose epidemic. And so for my harm reduction loved ones and friends here, like, that is one specific way you can plug in to remove police from these situations, because that has got me riled. What does CPIC stand for, Rob? Did you find out? Collaborative planning.
It's in the chat. It's in the chat. Collaborative Planning and Implementation Committee, and it's essentially a working group that's being held or convened by the mayor's office and in collaboration with BPD and the monitor and all kinds of other folks, and they're trying to bring community members into it to weigh in and to be to have directly impacted folks a part of the conversation around how this policy gets shaped. And the main charge is to work on the 911 diversion policy. How can the pilot program that the mayor's office implemented to divert certain call types away from BPD to a non-BPD response, essentially. And how can that be built out? And so that's the context for how this conversation happened.
Yeah, thank you. And I really am grateful you invited me to that meeting. And I really call upon all folks who are working on naloxone distribution, the thousands of people that Harriet and Dave and everybody have trained in administering naloxone. I mean, those are spaces that we should be in, because Department of Justice has said that the Baltimore Police Department needs to get its shit together. And these are spaces where that is, at least on paper, how that's happening in process. Like, this is part of that. And so we need to be in those spaces, because I'm telling you, harm reduction that term is being abused in many of those conversations, and we need all hands on deck. And so that was an unexpected but completely expected soapbox of mine in this moment. But I'm so glad that came up, because we're talking about what can we do with this information, right? So before we got into me announcing the 87 different events and spaces and things that BHRC will create and cultivate for everyone, I want to ask both of you a question as we close out, move towards that. I love this question because I like thinking about it. What is a world in which drugs are decriminalized, in which drugs and paraphernalia are decriminalized? What is that world? What are you imagining in that universe?
I don't even know if I've given myself the space to imagine that far ahead, but I do love that question. Kind of just spitballing, I think for me would be to live in a society where people are not punished for their own individual actions that don't harm anyone else. And that people are accepted for who they are and where they are in their life. And that people's agency is, is respected, and people are not demonized for human emotions and behavior. Are just some of the things that come to mind because I haven't even thought of that world yet.
For me, it looks like a world without police, a world without jails, a world without capitalism, right? And we can wax on about whether that's socialism or communism, but a world in which we're sharing our resources equitably, a world where our communities have the autonomy to decide what is best for us collectively, and then that kind of whittles down, that drills down to individual agency as well, and that's respected and understood. It's a world where everyone has what they need, right? And so for the folks that do use to escape the brutal realities of capitalism, that may not be the impetus to use to begin with. For the folks that want to use because they like to get high, they can just fucking get high and enjoy themselves, right? Without the threat of punishment or social exile or whatever. Yeah, it looks like a world where everyone has what they need, and we live together with boundaries that are respected, and the agency that we need.
Yes, I love that so much. I really encourage everyone to explore that, right? Because what are we fighting for? What is this liberation towards, right? And that is what that's what abolition movement is for. It's burning it down to build something what we want, right? Build what we need and want. And so we have to do this kind of exercise. I am offering, because we do have some time, about 5 minutes or so, if anybody does have any questions. I know at least my coworkers, I know I can always turn to them because they always have amazing questions, but I'm wondering if anybody in the audience has a question or two for our panel. You can raise your hand. I think that is an option in Zoom. Okay, I'm going to ask my coworker, Dave. Dave Fell, are you here?
Yes.
Do you have any questions?
Well,
tell us who you are first.
Okay, I am Dave Fell. I work for Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition as a community outreach coordinator. Hopefully my internet's okay. I'm at the office. Sometimes the internet is fucked here.
You're great.
I do a lot of with Ricky and Harriet, a lot of street outreach and have a lot of conversations about paraphernalia. I was actually typing a comment that was pretty much along the lines of access to clean pipes and syringes is autonomy. And I talk to folks often about how it leads to autonomy, not just because we started handing out stems at the beginning of COVID under the guise of everyone needs one so you don't spread COVID, but really everyone deserves their own stem because it's just the right thing. You shouldn't have to share a broken ass stem just because you don't have access to clean tools.
And what's a stem?
A stem is a tool that we distribute that folks can smoke out of. It's a pipe, essentially.
Yeah. It's often derogatorily called a crack pipe.
Correct. So I just was just thinking about that. In terms of a question, I guess I was thinking about the drug exceptionalism thing. And I've been reading a lot about early in the jazz era when they in the late 30s, before the 1970s drug war started, there was like the Marijuana Tax Act and things like that. And it seems like it would have been like anything that jazz musicians liked, they would have criminalized. It like didn't really specifically aimed at Black jazz musicians so that they couldn't make money anymore. Because like if you get incarcerated for a drug offense, you're no longer allowed to like play at the clubs in New York City. And I'm just thinking about the drug exceptionalism thing, and I just wonder if no matter what, this isn't really a question, this is totally me just rambling at this point, but it just seems to me that anything that a Black jazz musician latched onto or as a community was lifted up as like, this is something that we love, would have been criminalized no matter what it was.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if you have any, I don't know, reflections on that or anything.
Yeah,
Sorry to
thank
take
you,
up so much
Dave.
space.
No, that's great. Thank you, Dave. Go ahead, Yanet.
The first thing that immediately came to my mind is speaking on marijuana, because that's just what I've been studying for the last couple of years, but the whole thing like, oh, why don't they just get a medical card and just, use medical marijuana? Why are you going through any other route? And it's, again, that thing where it's like, we're still talking about the same thing, but it's because this person is choosing to, or only can be able to get it through the Black market, is being criminalized. Whereas someone who could easily get a card and it's not an issue, they're fine. And, this is the way you should be doing it. So now it's like, oh, it's no longer so terrible. You shouldn't do it anymore. But, oh yeah, I guess, but only for medical reasons, or only if you have a medical card, which doesn't take into account just the whole lack of access to healthcare, also just the stigma that comes with for folks to even have that medicinally within the Black community, and then also the rights that you lose once you register to get a medical marijuana card. So then another way to lose your Second Amendment rights. So it's that kind of like, oh, it's acceptable when this person does it this way, but if you do it any other way, you should be criminalized and punished for that, which is completely ridiculous. And even which I'm concerned about is just even moving towards legalization is the criminalization, even more criminalization of that Black market. That's something I really am terrified about, and want to make sure that we set up some guardrails to protect folks, because I definitely do see that kind of like the shift in like we've seen with medicinal happening once we legalize as well. And I think that also just comes back down, both it being rooted in racism, but also capitalism, because they tax ridiculously at the dispensary. I think folks that can afford would prefer because they have higher strains or whatever, but it's like, it's expensive. And so people are definitely going to still continue to go through the Black market and should not be criminalized and punished for that when the state is profiting and dispensaries look like Apple stores. This is ridiculous.
Yes, and why is it the Black market? It's so true, right? We know. And I think I just want to say, how many cards do they expect us to hold, right? Because it's the medical marijuana card, the syringe service participant card. We have to carry all these cards. We have to prove that we have these cards. How do I prove anything to a cop ever, other than what they're already walking into when looking at me, right? Like, and that I really, and that's why I'm like going mad, because I'm just like, this is the same argument that we hear about syringe service. They're like, we gave you an exception for anybody who is a card carrying participant of a syringe service program. They just need to have their card, and then we'll know that they are authorized to carry those supplies. And it's wild, and so I just think that those things are really, I just like, God, all these cards that people have to have, like, how big are these wallets? Okay, so people are off on this. So you started something, Rob, with these dispensary prices. We have another question from Anika. And then,
I don't know nothing about that. But
right, you don't know anything, of course not.
Anika got a question.
Let's focus on that. Okay, we're going to take that question, then we're going to go on to the resources. Do you think you can ask the question out loud, or do you want me to, Anika?
Yeah, hello. I can ask out loud for everyone here. So the question is about the relationship between the racist war on drugs and medical institutions. How is the co-optation of harm reduction by medicine hindering the fight for decriminalization of any drug specifically?
Oh, that's such a good question. Even the idea of medical marijuana, right? Versus. Y'all have thoughts on that?
It's definitely frustrating because I think I've heard the argument a lot that's like, oh, you shouldn't use it for recreational, only for medicinal. And so kind of like there's that whole, I think, separating like, oh, this is acceptable, but this is not acceptable thing. And I haven't given too much thought about how it's been harmful to decriminalization, but I think that that concept in itself has been harmful because it's like, oh, we've already done something. That the response I've gotten from some legislators is like, oh, we just did something on medicinal marijuana. We don't need to do something again. We need to wait till we perfect this industry before we go back and try to do something else, and all these kind of like excuses. But I think I was looking at just like the statistics of who is taking advantage of medicinal marijuana in Maryland, and it's majority white people, upper class white people. And so that's even more infuriating because it's kind of like scapegoating the arguments that we're making in legalization by saying, oh, we already did this with medicinal. And it's like, no, we did not. I think the only reason that really the General Assembly is considering it is twofold. It's because there's more tax revenue that they think they'll be able to get. I think especially seeing, I think, was it Massachusetts or some other, or Illinois, that was able to get $1 billion in revenue this last year from marijuana sales. And so it's that. And I think also to try to get the governor's house back and thinking that, putting on the ballot will get more folks out, but it's not actually to address the actual harms. And so that's frustrating. And people scapegoat it as like, oh, we really did something on medicinal, so this isn't as urgent, right? That was urgent,
Right.
we did something. And now it's like, yeah, we'll get it right eventually kind of thing, and kind of slow walking it when people's lives are being completely derailed as we speak. And so off the basis of that alone, we should be acting quickly and not further delaying it. So that's kind of just been the frustrating and kind of what's been slowing down, I think, our efforts to fully legalize.
Yeah. And I want to, again, as I see that in translation to non-cannabis drugs, right? And the co-option of cannabis as a medical, in this medical context, the co-option of harm reduction in a medical context, it whitewashes it. Why is it that in both cases it has whitewashed these things, right? It has whitewashed cannabis, it has whitewashed harm reduction. Why is that, right? And also that medical institutions are also systems of this culture of racism that they also perpetuate and are harmful. They perpetuate and uphold racism, right? So we see that time and time again, and not only working with cops, right? There's that, but also just the way that our bodies are treated in these ways, even to say people suffering with addiction. It's like, wow, like we are this. So I think I can think and yell all day about the co-option of harm reduction, but I think those are some things I'm kind of seeing as patterns. Rob, go ahead.
Something I was putting in the chat is like, who actually has access to healthcare, right?
Mm,
As long as healthcare is linked to employment, and as long as employment is fucked in this country, like you're only talking about middle class and up, right? Like the vast majority of people that actually need access to these decriminalized and easily accessible materials won't have access to it if you're framing it through this medical framework. And I'm just uplifting the fact that like the medical industrial complex is that it's designed to create profit for the elite and capitalists, not to care for people. Otherwise, we would have seen, access for all during a fucking pandemic. So like, I just, no, yes, thank you for the question. And I just feel like it all goes back to anti-Blackness and capitalism within America. Yeah.
oof, yeah, wow. Yeah, thank you all so much for even though I kept saying there's no questions, but a couple folks were like, you can ask questions. So I'm really glad we did that. So now we get to, what can I do with this? What are you asking of me? I am digesting a lot right now, right? I'm sure, of course, the first thing for everyone to do is to, again, breathe and let yourself continue to absorb and be challenged by what you're hearing and thinking, right? That's always the number one thing. I think something that has come up a lot as I've been preparing for this event with these brilliant folks is that the police will always come up with other tools and reasons. Like if they have it, they will use it. They will come up with ways to continue to incarcerate us, right? If we fully decriminalize paraphernalia, that removes police from interactions with folks who are carrying supplies that are healthcare supplies, recreational use supplies, whatever. These are people's possessions. We're removing police from that. And so, you know, I think about the fact that as syringe service programs, we are required to, and I appreciate Zoe had asked me something, Zoe Renfro had asked me, you know, thinking about the fact that in order to get authorized to be a syringe service program, we are required to have some interaction with law enforcement. We have to let them know that we are an authorized syringe service program, or, you know, I would like them to know, they would like to know who our participants are, you know, and their reasons are, oh, so that we know that they're carrying the card, right? That's another way. I'm like, I'm not going to snitch, right? Absolutely not. I'm not going to give you these folks' names. Why do you think that's okay to ask me that? You know, that type of thing. It's like, what are we actually doing? You know, they're trying to create these other systems, continue to reinforce those systems. And we just need to remove them from this entirely. And so those are some things that we need to remember. Okay, this is a lot of information and you can get this in your email, but what can you do with this? Specifically on Friday at 10 a.m., we are really trying to get up in Ferguson's DMs and public Twitter. So we are doing our first Twitter storm at BHRC. We're cute, we're trying. So Friday at 10 a.m., please be on Twitter and follow us. It's Be More HRC on Twitter. Our hashtag for this is Decrim Our Works. Works is another term a lot of our friends and loved ones use for the supplies that we give them. So Decrim Our Works. And we are asking for we're asking Senate President Bill Ferguson to bring SB 424 a vote to override the veto imposed by Governor Larry Hogan. So just be on Twitter, repost, reshare, tag your representatives, tag your senators, let them know, because they think that there are people who don't care about this issue. They do. They think, oh, we'll let this one slide. A lot of us have elections next year. We don't want to look soft on crime. Let's let this one pass. That is a thought that politicians are told to think, right? Because of whatever horrible reasons they're told to think that. We need to let them know that this is a big issue and it's urgent kind of right now. So that's one thing you can do. If you don't have Twitter, you know somebody who is always on Twitter. We all do. That is the state of affairs right now in 2021. So ask your people to do this. Tag us. You know, we're about that life. So you can send as many tweets as you want. You can, Senate President Ferguson is from District 46. That is a lot of Baltimore City. So you can, get those folks involved. And so we're just trying to get that to happen. So that's one thing you can do on Friday. You can do that in your bed with the lights off under your covers. It's a great idea. These delightful people are folks you want to interact with. And I hope I'm actually sharing my screen. I am, right? Okay, cool. I had a moment just now. Okay, so that's Harriet and that's Cam. They work at BHRC. They're amazing. They're hosting a Facebook Live event tomorrow from 5:30 to 6. Just kind of, as we've been saying, digesting the lessons from this, and also doing crafts and having conversation and helping folks to frame if they're going to be tweeting. How do I tweet? What am I going to do? So join folks on, again, it's Be More HRC on Facebook. Apparently special guests will be there, so that's exciting. Another place I'm inviting everyone to come through every first Thursday of the month in 2021 and probably moving forward. Next Thursday being that at 4 p.m. via Zoom, you can join me and Owen and other harm reductionists across the state in the Maryland Harm Reduction Action Network. We will be talking about paraphernalia decriminalization quite a bit next week. So join us for that. What else do we have? Oh, I'm wearing a shirt. You want it? It's pretty awesome. Whoop. I'm wearing it right now. It's super comfy. It says very boldly, decriminalize paraphernalia. what a great idea to get this shirt and then take a picture of yourself and put that on Twitter and say, hey, Senate President Ferguson, wouldn't you like this pretty cool shirt? So let us know. You can buy it $15 to $25, sliding scale, get some for your friends. If that is above your pay grade, let us know. We'll send it to you. I'm not tripping. I just want you to have the shirt, to be quite honest with you. Let us know the size and the mailing address. And as I mentioned, this is a series of educational events that we're calling More Than a Needle, More Than a Crack Pipe. The next and last of this series is Thursday, November 18th at 6 p.m. We'll be joined by Dr. Helena Hansen, who is the author of Re-Racialization of Addiction and the Redistribution of Blame in the White Opioid Epidemic, Race as a Ghost Variable in White Opioid Research. She's got a lot of words and she's here to tell us about them. So we're really going to be talking about, I think my summary is, this bill, SB 420, was the only bill passed in legislation that could have actually done anything to really curb the overdose epidemic. It was the only one passed. And so let's talk about that. And that is definitely if there's any message that policymakers should be convinced by, that is one of them. Lastly, we love feedback. So please, and I'm going to ask my coworkers to put the links in the chat, give us feedback on this event. We'd love that. Is that it? That is it. I went through all of those. Yanet and Rob, is there anything you want to share with the people? Ask them to come to?
Well, if there are folks who are interested in plugging into the police accountability organizing that's happening focusing on the jurisdiction you live in, I can drop my email in the chat. And also, if you just want more information about the legalization bill that we're working on as well, I'll drop that in the chat. I'll drop my email in the chat for that.
Yeah, put it in the chat. You can text defund BPD to 22999 to join Organizing Black's text list. We got some things rolling out, but nothing pressing in the moment. Rajani, you're on mute.
I'm so excited. I talked to myself. Thank you. Y'all are amazing. This was just what I needed. I appreciate you. Thank you for joining me. This is the end of our event. Everybody have a lovely evening. Drink water, drink whatever you want. If you're going to consume anything, be with a buddy or let them know it's happening. We appreciate you. I'm going to stop recording. Thank y'all.